Welcome back to Prototyping Hour with Davey. In our last video, we built a really simple component that just rendered out hi or bye and a name based on some properties that we passed into a component. This time, we're going to look at building a counter. So we're going to put a number on a page, and we're going to put some buttons on the page to increment and decrement that counter. And it's going to be some more absolutely riveting work. So, but in all honesty, it's fun to learn. I love learning. So hopefully this is helpful. So the first thing we're going to do is inside of our source components directory, we're going to create a new file called counter. So we'll do source components. We're going to call this counter.tsx. Just like in our last component, the first thing we're going to do is import React from React. And then we're going to define our constant, export it as a React function component. So we're going to say export. It's going to be counter. Oops, sorry. Export const counter is a React function component and a fat arrow function like so. And it's going to return some things. So React always, or JSX always expects that there is only one parent element inside of a return statement. What that basically means is I can't do, I don't know what that is. What is an O tag? Nobody knows. All right. So I can't do like two P tags side by side like so. React would get mad. And if I did that, it would tell me you can't do that. Please only have one parent. So to avoid that, we need an opening div. So we'll throw a div in here. And this is where we will put all of our stuff. Sometimes you'll see this is like React Fragment. That's common, which basically gives React a parent to like one parent element to deal with, but it doesn't get rendered on the page as a div. Maybe you don't want an extra div on your page. So you can use React Fragment. You can also use just an empty tag like that, which is pretty common. In fact, we'll leave it like that. How about that? So in here, we're going to have some text. Maybe it's an H1, and it's going to be a count, right? And then we're going to have some buttons. So we'll have button, and one is going to say increment, and the other one is going to say decrement. And that's going to be pretty rad. So let's head over to our app.tsx file now and import that. So we're going to replace our greeting component with our counter. So we'll remove all the references to greeting, and we'll say import counter from ./components/counter. We don't need the TSX or the L. And then we'll render it on the page with an HTML tag of counter. Let's make sure our app is running. So inside your project directory, inside terminal, you can run yarn start. And when that fires up, we will see some things on the page. Is this running? It is. It's just waiting. There we go. We have count on the page with our increment and decrement buttons. Nothing, this doesn't do anything yet. It's all just hard code nonsense. So let's make it do some things. Inside our counter, we're going to make use of a React hook known as useState. And useState is basically a way for us to manage, like do some real low level state management or keep track of where a thing is, the state of a thing inside our component up until the page reloads, basically. React useState is not, it does not persist between page loads. You'd have to use an external state library for that. We are not going to cover that. That's crazy. That's way outside the realms of this course. But the upside is when you're prototyping, useState works totally fine. It gets the job done. Maybe was that like a Chevy commercial? So up here, we're going to say import React, comma, because we want to import something else. And in parentheses, or sorry, curly braces, we're going to say use state. So there's something here I want to draw your attention to. First is that React itself it's called the default export. It is a class-based component that is exported from the React library. And because it's class-based and it's a default export, it's imported without curly braces. Use state, however, is a function-based component that is not a default export because function components cannot be default exports. So use state is imported using curly braces. And we use that exact same pattern when we imported both greeting and counter into app.tsx. So it's something to keep a lookout for. So inside of our function now, we're going to define a new constant. We're going to put this inside square brackets. We're going to call this count and set count. Basically, we're defining a variable, a getter. So we're going to get a variable called count, and we're going to set a variable called count. So use state takes getters and setters, and then we're going to say this equals use state, and we're going to pass in an initial value for this variable, for this state object. When I say state object, I mean it could literally be an object too. If it was something complicated, it could be like a whole JavaScript object, something complicated. In our case, it's going to be a 0. We'll throw a semicolon in. And then down here, we're going to replace the word count with the variable count. So we're just going to call count just like that. So what we're going to see here is when we save this file and we come back, instead of count now, we're going to see 0. And if we were to replace the 0 with anything else, 8,293, you would see that it gets that instead. So we're passing in that initial value for that state object into the useState function, and then we call it here. So this is all fine and dandy, but now we need to wire up our increment and decrement buttons. So I'm going to do this 2 different ways because I think it's useful to know. The first way I'm going to do this is I'm going to call set state directly on the onClick property of a button, and then the second way is I'm going to define a function to handle that as well, because both instances are going to come in handy, and I'll explain why and when here in a minute. So on our first button, we're going to add an onClick property. We're going to set this equal to curly braces, and we're going to create a fat arrow function, and then we're going to call set count, and then we need to tell it what to set the count to. So it should be 1 more than it is now. So we can say count plus 1. So what we'll see is when we save that and we come over here and we start to increment, we're going to go up by 1 every time we click. Decrement obviously does nothing, but increment is working pretty well. So now let's handle the other way. So inside of our function, outside of our return statement, we're going to create a new constant for a function, and we're going to call this decrement. So simple fat arrow function here. Is that even what they're called, or do I just like saying fat arrow? I also realized this morning that I like to say the time 10:08 because I think it rolls off the tongue very nicely. 10:08. 10:08. 10:08. Anyways, Const Decrement, and we're basically going to do the same thing we did with this onClick handler here down on line 13, but we're going to call it from this function instead. So we're going to call set count, and we're going to tell it what to set the count to. So count -1 in this case. Ugh, this cold is whooping me. Okay, so set count -1. Now, on this onClick handler, we are going to say onClick equals, and in this case, we're just going to reference the constant name. We're not going to do any, we're not going to pass anything. It's just going to read decrement, just like that. And then when we save it, we'll come over here and we can see when that reload. Oh, I guess it doesn't even, it's just hot reloading. That's neat. So we can increment and decrement now, and that's pretty cool. Now, why, you might ask, would we need to define a separate function instead of just calling it directly on the button itself? That's a good question you just asked me. Let me tell you why. Maybe there's something else that we want to do when we click that button. Maybe we don't just want to decrement. Maybe we want to do something else, right? So we could also be really obnoxious, and we could call alert. You clicked down. So anytime we click decrement, we're going to decrease the value and pop up an alert. And that, I think we just built, well, I don't know. I feel like maybe we just built every website UI from the last 3 years. So I guess one final thing to note here is you can define multiple state objects. So I could have another state object in here that was like, whatever, name and set name. And I could also do something with that as well, right? So use state, initial name is Felicia. Poor Felicia. And then I could render name in here as well, right? So name. And maybe when I click decrement, instead of just alerting, I could set the name to some other variable. Like, oh, what am I doing here? I hit too many buttons and my computer froze. All right. So we could set this to Davy when you click the button. So initially, now that I've caused my, what did I break? Oh, I deleted a curly brace. You get to see me wrestle with my editor, and that's always fun. So we can set an, there. Little refresh and we're fine. So now when I click decrement, we'll go down a number and set the name to Davy. And there you go. That's two different state objects inside the same component, all being handled by the same button. And that's state. So in the next video, we're going to talk about how to send these state values or these values back up to a parent component where the state might be managed. So if we wanted to keep track of state inside app.tsx, but we had a button inside our counter that was supposed to do something, we'll see how to make that work. So in the next video, we'll create a counter wrapper that will manage the state, and then we'll have a counter itself that handles the buttons and what to do with those buttons and sends values back up to the parent that we can then do something with in the wrapper itself. Cool beans.